So why don't we get started? Again, for those of you who don't know me, I'm David Wilkins. I'm the faculty director of the Harvard Law School Center on the Legal Profession, and this is our continuing speaker series in which we bring in interesting people who are doing interesting things in the legal profession. And our guest today meets all those categories in an exemplary way. Kathryn, I've had the privilege of getting a chance to know her here, and some of you may also, because she's been teaching here this term. But Katrin Kuhlmann is the president and founder of New Markets Lab, a legal and regulatory think tank and innovation lab that improves systems for economic law and regulation to generate broad-based opportunity and entrepreneurship. Now, that's a big ambition, okay? And it's one, as we think about the world today, that is critically important if globalization's actually going to work. Not just for people at the top, not just for a few, but for everybody. And you can see she's a very popular teacher because she's brought in a horde of people. So with that, I should be quiet and you should listen to Katrin. Katrin, please.
Thank you. Well, thank you all. I'm so glad to see so many people right before Thanksgiving. And excited about giving this talk this noon. So for those of you whom I haven't met, lovely to meet you. I'll show some slides, and then we'll have time for Q&A. And I'll explain exactly what Professor Wilkins was just talking about with my organization and what I do. So let me start with just telling you a little bit about what this is, and maybe how I got there, because 20 years ago, I was sitting in a classroom here, and not in this building, it didn't exist 20 years ago, but at the law school trying to figure out how I could build a career in international law. And I had always been very interested in the economic side of international law. I was very interested in markets, how markets developed, what that meant as a lawyer, and wasn't quite sure what the path looked like into that. So I'll tell you a little bit as I go along about what I did before New Markets Lab, because it's all helped shape the organization as it is now. But I started out as a lawyer in private practice, as some of you may also do, and then went on after that to be a trade negotiator. And it was during the time that I was a trade negotiator that I really noticed where there's some gaps in the system. I'll show you in a second my slide with the gaps. But New Markets Lab was created to fill some of those gaps that I saw. And I called it a lab because I wanted it to be about innovation. I wanted to use the law as a tool for changing things. I didn't want us to think about law as a static force. I wanted us to think about it as something dynamic that was constantly changing. But I also wanted it to be a driver. I wanted law to be the entry point to what we did, the entry point to changing markets, the entry point to improving markets, to making them work in a more inclusive way, and the force that would do all that, which I truly believe that it is. So over the course of the time that I've had the organization, which is about 7 years now, I guess, we've developed a methodology, which I'll tell you about. I'll show you how it works, actually. I'll show you a couple of examples of our work. And a set of tools, and I'll talk about those in a moment too. And then partnerships all over the world, which is a big part of this, because we can't do this by ourselves. It has to be done in partnership. And we also have a team of lawyers from all over the world. And when I say all over the world, I truly mean all over the world. We have lawyers on our team from Kenya, Ethiopia, Japan, Colombia, India, China, Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa. And part of the approach that we try to take is that there's not one answer. There's not just one way of doing all of this, that maybe we need to learn from each other and try to think about different approaches. But our work, as I said before, is all focused on economic law and regulation. I have started out my career doing trade. So we do a lot of work around trade law, but in a different form than what I had done when I was in the government. And we work on all sorts of other issues. We work on land issues. We work on labor issues. We work on banking and financial services. So let me show you a little bit what I mean with all of this. This is, by the way, a farm in Tanzania that I'm going to go back to in a minute. And these are varieties of seed potato, which for some of you probably already heard me talk about seed potatoes. But some of you may not have, so we'll talk about seed potatoes in a minute. Okay, this is our theory of change, if you will. And as I said before, law and regulation are very central to our model. But we have to have a starting point. So how do we think about where law and regulation comes in? It has to come in through something that's happening in the market. And we start with that though. So again, I told you when I started my career, I was working, particularly when I was working in government, I was working at very high level policy, making trade agreements, negotiating trade agreements. I worked with about 20 different countries on developing US trade policy and negotiating all different sorts of trade agreements. I negotiated what we call non-tariff measures, which are basically everything that I do now. Every rule that relates to how the market is structured. I negotiated intellectual property. I negotiated things like poultry market access, which for those of you who do trade, you will know that's what it comes down to sometimes, are these very, very specific things that you think that you're never going to know that much about. But I was up here. I was working with other governments. We were looking at broader legal principles. We were looking at the World Trade Organization and how that shaped our relationship with a number of different countries. And I kept thinking, what is there that we don't know? What do we not know about the market that should influence these negotiations? Do we know, for example, where there's potential for business growth on one side or the other? Where small and medium-sized enterprises are growing? Do we know how women are engaging in the economy in all of these different countries? And by and large, we didn't know all of those things. We knew certain things. We knew which industries were prominent in the market. We knew where there was commercial growth to some degree, but we didn't know where that untapped potential was. And it's been something that's fascinated me, particularly over the last 10 years. How do you figure out what that untapped potential is in the market? So one of the things that we try to do with our work now is think about what's not happening yet. And how can you use law to catalyze what's not happening yet in the market? Or something that's just beginning to start. How can you use law as a force to really get that opportunity to open up? And again, I'll show you really concretely what I mean with a couple of examples. But law, as I said before, is the change agent. It's the thing that moves all of this. It is the force that drives this whole circle. But the market opportunity is where it starts. So once we identify where there's an opportunity in the market, then we start to work to understand what the legal system looks like around that. And again, you'll see in a couple of minutes when I say really understanding the legal system, I mean really understanding it. Digging into it in a great degree of detail and picking apart piece by piece by piece how the system works. Now, one of the things that I saw when I was doing trade negotiations is that it's one thing to get an agreement on paper. And we spent a lot of time working hard to get agreements on paper. But it's another thing entirely to make sure that that agreement is going to work in practice, that everyone understands it, that you have all of the stakeholders behind that agreement, not just the ministers who sign it, but everybody who's going to be impacted by it has some kind of a sense of what's in there and how it will impact them. And I think that if, for those of us who are thinking about these things probably at the moment, looking at where some of the discussion is happening in the United States around trade, I feel like it's some of the same thing. How do you make sure that these very high-level agreements and these very high-level standards are really making their way down to the individual, to the person who's impacted by them? So we work on really picking apart the system, and then we try to figure out how you can leverage change. How can you build partnerships around the legal and regulatory principles and try to really get something to move forward? And then once you've done that, once you've changed something, and I've seen this work time after time after time, I think, in my opinion, I think this kind of approach where you really start at the grassroots level, you start with something very particular, and you try to work your way up rather than working your way down from the high-level principles. It works. It works, but then you can scale it. You can take it back up to the high level and look at how maybe a trade agreement should be impacted, or look at how a bigger practice could be built around this. And then I think that we also have to do things like teach the model and try to figure out how to scale it and share information more broadly. So, and I think I mentioned before, or you heard in the introduction, that part of the approach too is about inclusivity. How can you reach those who are not already part of the market, who have a real stake in it? Okay, so this is, I keep trying to find the perfect map of this. I can't do it, but this is an imperfect map of something that I want you to see. Markets are changing. When we think about markets very often, I think we think about something going across a border maybe. This is a map of what they call trade corridors in sub-Saharan Africa. And again, I cannot find a good map of the trade corridors. But if you look at this map, you see that there are no country boundaries on this map. That there are these big lines, in some cases, that are going through a large part of the continent. And what I want you to think about with this is the fact that markets are no longer what we necessarily thought they were at one point. They're very rarely just within one country, within one set of national boundaries. They cross-cut. And in order to get something like this to work, which I wish we could depict a little bit better, you have to think about not only the road that goes from one place to another, but everything else around that. The set of rules that are going to make that work, the societies that these roads cut through, the industries that are built around them. So this is something that we've actually embedded into a lot of our work, this concept of a corridor, where you're moving across boundaries and you're trying to think about how you can cluster in all sorts of other types of investments, whether it be investment in social systems, economic investment, investment in industries that are not already represented. So I said before that I was going to show you where I thought the gaps were. This is our picture of the gaps. I gave a presentation a while ago and I noticed everybody was sort of scribbling. And I was trying to figure out what they were scribbling, and they were trying to figure out why it was set up the way that it is. But if you see, it matches actually these building blocks. So one of them is an information gap. I mean, one of the challenges with all of this is that there are a lot of rules around how markets are set up. And most people don't have access to that type of information. And one of the examples that I'm about to show you, just for one particular sector, we looked at about 70 different laws. So even though this information is in the public domain and everyone can get access to it, it's not really accessible. So I went once, right after I had finished working as a trade negotiator, and I had shifted into the nonprofit world to do development, which was something I was really passionate about. I went to Morocco. And I went to Morocco because the United States had just signed a trade agreement with Morocco. And I wanted to understand what the view was on the ground of that trade agreement. And what I heard time after time after time was that it had absolutely no connection to people's everyday lives. So we had worked so hard to get this trade agreement. My colleagues had worked so hard to get this perfect trade agreement that covered everything that we thought it needed to cover. And yet when you talk to an average person, to somebody who was working in one of the sectors, they said, that doesn't really impact us. Now, part of that, I think, is just that there wasn't really a knowledge of what was in the agreement and how the agreement would have an impact. But I think, again, there was this disconnect between this sort of high-level law and policy and what was really happening. Now, this is true for policymakers, too, and for lawmakers. I think that policymakers and lawmakers don't always have a lot of information as well. So another thing is there's a systems gap. Just like the market law is a system. But really understanding how it works means that you have to understand the pieces, both individually and as a whole. Implementation gap, I talked about this already, that there's this disconnect between what's on paper, what we see in an agreement, what we see in a law, and how things really work in practice. Inclusivity gap, we've talked about as well, which is that the systems don't always reflect the voices of everybody who's impacted by them. And a feedback gap, I think, too. How laws are made, how regulations are made is something that I think about constantly. Last year, I spent half of my time in another country. 26 weeks out of the year last year, I was traveling. I was either in sub-Saharan Africa, I was in India, and you see time and time again how people relate to the system of law. And there's not really, in many places, a good way of interacting with the system. We have a whole system here. You probably have taken administrative law, or you've probably thought about how rules are made. Maybe you yourselves have tried to influence the system sometimes. But in a lot of places, though, most people feel like they don't have complete access to the system. And then market failures. I think there are a lot of places where, again, we hope that the market is going to work to deliver what it should, and I hope that it will work to deliver real benefit, but it doesn't always do that. And so how do you correct the failures in the market? How do you make sure that there's also then this balance between where the market can grow and protecting the social side of things? So this is my last slide before I start giving you some examples. So these are some of the things that we've done to try to close some of these gaps. So one of the things that we saw, again, was that, as I said, the information is sometimes so vast and isn't presented, and it's not always presented in a way that's very clear. So we started putting together what we call legal guides, trying to parse through a lot of laws and put them into something that was as clear and simple as possible. And the first one that we did was in East Africa. And it was a project that came up. We were working with a group called the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs. And somebody said, we're having trouble with investment contracts in the region. And it seems like every time we're rewriting the rules, every time we're doing a very long version of an agreement, and it's not fitting with what's happening in the market. So maybe we need to standardize so that we don't need lawyers in the room. And in fact, what we needed to do was put something together that gave people the information that they needed so that they could negotiate better contracts. It wasn't that the contracts weren't important, it wasn't that you didn't need lawyers, but it was that without that information on what the rules of the market were, it was very hard to negotiate a good contract. So we've now done a lot of these. We did this one in East Africa that covered a whole range of things. We've done them on very specific sectors or specific products. We've also done what I call test cases. Now we're doing this in a couple of places in sub-Saharan Africa right now, where there's a new agreement, perhaps, or a new regulation, but it's never actually been tested in practice. Nobody has ever applied it. So it exists somewhere on paper, but in practice it doesn't exist at all. So one of the ways that we're trying this out is throughout sub-Saharan Africa, and I should have shown you another map of the regional economic communities, there are a lot of trade agreements that overlap. And as part of those trade agreements, countries then have to bring their domestic systems in line with these new rules. So we're seeing this in areas like seed, fertilizer, all aspects of trade. But again, there's a system on paper that nobody has ever tried. I'll give you an example in a second of where we did this. So we're literally working to test this out. We're working with companies step by step, going through the process and seeing what happens and documenting it and trying to learn from it so that maybe the next time the process will work a bit better. We do a lot of case studies. We do a lot of case studies with entrepreneurs where there's a particular problem that they're having in the market, something that they're trying to do, some kind of issue that they're running up against, some kind of legal and regulatory standard that they're trying to understand. And we work with them step by step to try to go through those things. I've also been working with students on these so that students can see the process of law from the eyes of an entrepreneur. And then we do something that we call systems mapping, which I'll show you in a second what that looks like. So this was one of our early projects, and some of you are probably, it's still going on. So we started this project in 2007 in Tanzania. And what happened was, here's another example of a corridor, by the way. This is called the Southern Agricultural Growth Corridor of Tanzania, SAGCOT. And this corridor is actually just within Tanzania. So this was my map of the corridors. This is a little, a much more sort of bird's eye view of a corridor. This one is just within Tanzania, but it's about the size of Italy. So it goes from Dar es Salaam all the way down to the southern border of Tanzania. And it goes through the main agricultural growth center of the country. And if any of you have ever been to Tanzania, it's an incredibly lush, rich, diverse country with a lot of agricultural potential. So the idea behind this corridor, and the corridors that I showed you before on that map, where I said the markets are changing, those corridors are some of the traditional trade routes in Africa. And they were built around something other than agriculture. They were built around mineral deposits and mining, and built as a way to try to move some of that resource wealth out of Africa and into other markets. So Nelson Mandela had this vision for turning that kind of approach, though, that corridors approach where you could cluster activity into something that could actually be used to try to promote agriculture, which is still supporting the majority of the people in sub-Saharan Africa. And so this was an initiative then that came about for a number of different reasons. One was that the corridors movement was starting to gain more momentum. Another one was that the president of Tanzania really wanted to try to put the country on the map as an agricultural growth center. a number of companies came together and said, this is something that we want to do. We want to try to promote growth in agriculture. What are we going to do about it? And the World Economic Forum got behind it. It was sort of all of these different things happening at the same time, a lot of focus on food security in the international community. So this was launched, which is really exciting, right? But then the question comes of, how do you operationalize this? How do you really make this work? And one of the things that they were doing to operationalize it, of course, is trying to get investment in the corridor, because you can't have the corridor doesn't work if you don't have anything behind it. But again, law, regulation, policy are one of the main forces that are going to get that investment to happen. So we started working with a farm along that corridor in the southern highlands of Tanzania called Matanga. And this was very, very early stage. The corridor wasn't even really operational yet. It was one of the first farms along the corridor. But it was a group of investors, African investors, who saw this opportunity in the market in potatoes. And potatoes were before that. So Tanzania had been farming potatoes for years, but had absolutely no commercial industry in potatoes. And they had about 150,000 small farmers producing potatoes, though most of them women, and not making enough money for the sector to become commercial at all. And so these investors saw this opportunity and thought, this is great. Trucks are coming up from South Africa, selling potatoes in the market. They're turning around, going back empty. Why don't we have an industry in potatoes? We should do something about this. So they found a farm and started off. Now, not too far into this, though, they ran into a problem. And the problem was that in Tanzania, as in most other countries in sub-Saharan Africa, you cannot sell a product that hasn't been approved, certified by the government. So the potatoes themselves, Tanzania didn't have the right kind of seed to grow healthy commercial potatoes. So they had to get the seed material from someplace else. And it was really interesting because in this particular case, the investor said, this is completely domestic. This has nothing to do with trade. There's no cross-border issue here at all. This is completely domestic investment, pure and simple. And it turns out that it wasn't. It was mainly a domestic issue, but they had to get the seed from somewhere. And Kenya had the seed. Now, Tanzania and Kenya had an agreement saying that they should allow for that seed to flow freely across the border. But most people didn't know that there was even an agreement that said that. And when it came time to implement it, that was not exactly what happened. We had to do a lot of negotiating to get the agreement to actually become operational. So we worked and worked and worked with this farm. I'm going to show you something else here in a second. And finally got the agreement to work. This is what I said when I was referring to when I said regulatory mapping. So this is a flow chart, essentially, of the process for getting a new seed approved on the market in Tanzania. And you don't have to look at all the particular steps, but it's pretty long, right? And fairly complicated. And does anybody think this happens quickly? No, right? So this can take years to go through this. And the other thing that's notable about this is you don't necessarily just go through it once. You go through it multiple times sometimes. I think it looks like a board game, and you'll get sent back to the top, and then you go back through, and then you go back to go, and you go back through. So what happened in this particular case was, so the company realized that in order to commercialize seed, and again, this is true throughout sub-Saharan Africa. I spent a lot of time in Washington in these policy discussions about food security, and something like this has a huge impact. You can't get higher yields. These farmers that were producing potatoes in Tanzania were getting hardly any yields on their crops because what they were using as seed material had diseases in it, which happens with potato seed, pests. They couldn't grow enough hardly even to feed themselves, let alone to sell anything in the market. But you can't sell it in the market if you haven't gone through this process. It is illegal to sell it in the market if you haven't gone through this process. So every company, and again, think about how many companies you actually get in the market if this is the process that you have to go through. Not that many, right? But you have to go through this whole process, and the government is still nervous about something coming out on the other side, so they say, well, we're not going to go do it just once, we'll do it maybe 2 or 3 times. So in this particular case, we found an agreement, which is referenced over here. And what the agreement said was that if you've already had the seed registered in another country in the region, you can skip ahead. You don't have to go through the whole thing all over again. So that was what happened with these investors. We found this agreement that basically let us skip ahead and not have to go back to go. And what it did for them was it shortened the amount of time that they would have to take before their investment became viable from maybe 5 years, which they thought they were looking at one point, to 1.5. So they were able to get the seed onto the market much more quickly than they would have been able to otherwise. And it all came down to a trade agreement, which everybody was completely shocked by except for me, because I figured that there would be those issues. So we went through that process. This farm, everything starts going great. They're producing this new seed potato, they create jobs on the farm, they create jobs off of the farm, they're selling this higher yielding seed to farmers, the investment starts growing, they diversify. So then what happens? Then you have to figure out, so you got it to work for one farm, then you have to figure out how you get it to work for the whole corridor. So we started stage 2 then of this project and partnered with SAGCUT. And I spent about 3 weeks last summer traveling that entire corridor and meeting with farms all along the corridor to try to find out what their experiences were. What did they know? Did they know what that process was? Had they ever tried to go through it themselves? What were they experiencing? And so we documented all of that. And then we went through the entire legal system and looked at every single law that applied to seed and put it all together into one thing. And then got everybody in the room together. And I used those diagrams. We spent 2 days in a workshop with the government and the private sector. And I took those diagrams and walked everybody through them and said, is this what really happens? Is this what the law really says? Is this what the process actually is? And believe it or not, even though we had looked at the laws as we were doing all that, there was a lot of disagreement over what the process actually was. Even though it was written into the law, into the regulations fairly clearly, not everybody agreed on what it was. But we sort of negotiated our way through it and then came up with that diagram that I just showed you. So that diagram was actually produced after many, many hours of pouring through laws and many, many hours of talking through what actually happens. So we put all of this together, and meanwhile, again, here's this kind of higher level overlay. So our project now with SAGCUT is with a group called the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. This is an initiative that was launched by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and all of this, again, is a way to try to really spearhead a green revolution and food security and growth in agriculture in Africa. So as part of their efforts, Tanzania had agreed to do some very, very high-level things. The president had said, we will change laws in this area, and that will shorten the process for this, we'll simplify things here, we'll join this international convention. So this project was a way to try to figure out how do you actually implement these high-level recommendations that they made, these high-level commitments. And it's actually, we can see it working. Now, I think if we had started out from that very high level and tried to push, I'm not sure that things would be in the same place. I think that part of the reason that this has worked is because we had some real concrete intervention points. We had this farm, we had the corridor, we had this series of partnerships along it, and it was very practical. That 2-day workshop that I just mentioned, we had a second 2-day workshop at the end of last year as well. Very practical, step by step. I think too, if you break things sometimes down into these smaller steps, it's a lot harder for the process to be very political, because then you're talking about something very concrete. So this was our Tanzania potato case, and it's still going on, and now we're doing another phase of it to implement what we had come up with in that first phase. We have a lot of work in Tanzania, but not exclusively in Tanzania. We're working in about 15 different countries in sub-Saharan Africa and some of the others that I mentioned. So we got asked to look at another one of these assessments in Tanzania for a totally different sector, cosmetics. I have an independent clinical program that I've been doing here for the last 2 years, where I've gone with a group of students to Tanzania in January. And last year when we were on the January trip, we met a woman who had started a cosmetics business. And cosmetics is turning out to be a big sector of growth in countries like Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda. There's not much of a domestic industry yet, but a lot of opportunity opening up in the market. So this woman who had started a business said, I'm running into all of these regulatory issues that I don't know how to deal with. Is there some way that you can help us with this? So we started working with her and with this group called the International Growth Center, which is part of London School of Economics in Oxford, to try to figure out if we could help with these regulatory issues. It turns out that the government is also at the same time thinking about how to improve the business enabling environment. So last week, I sat down with the government and showed them what we had done on cosmetics. So she has a couple of different issues. This woman in the industry, the products again have to be registered, just like the seeds have to be registered. The manufacturing, if you want to go into manufacturing, which is what the government really wants to encourage, that also is a fairly lengthy process of registration. Importation is pretty, I'll show you in a second what importation looks like. And then customs valuation, which I won't go into, but it's basically how you decide what something is worth when it comes across the border. So these are our findings on the project so far. One of them is that, and again, as I said in the beginning, I don't think that there are necessarily answers in all of this, but I do think that there are ways to work through some of these issues. And one of the findings that we've come up with on this is that you can regulate in different ways. You can choose where you want to regulate your market. On my seed example, they're regulating the market at the front end. So nothing goes into the market if it hasn't gone through this whole regulatory process. But not every country does things like that. South Africa doesn't do things that way, for example. The United States doesn't do things that way either. We tend to have an approach more that if you put something out into the market, you have to be able to stand by it. And then if there's a problem, you enforce it. But you don't necessarily control everything at the front end. You don't regulate everything before it hits the market. But this is a concept that I think bears a lot more discussion, because particularly I've found in a lot of countries where they don't have a good enforcement system, they don't have the police force, they don't have the laboratories, they don't have the whole infrastructure around how to enforce laws, it tends to then fall more on this front end where everything is enforced more heavily before it gets into the market. So here's the process for importing cosmetics into Tanzania. Now, I really like these diagrams because I feel like you can take something, and again, this is multiple laws. Every color in here, by the way, is a different agency, a different institution that's involved in the process. So we presented this to the government last week as they think about the business enabling environment. And everybody loves to talk about the business enabling environment, right? The World Bank is benchmarking and doing all these indicators. And as you probably can tell from my presentation, I like to figure out how things work and figure out how you can actually do something to change them. And I really do think as lawyers we hold the key to this, because it is the laws that dictate how this all moves. The laws are the ones that make the market in many, many ways. But this is quite complicated. And again, I don't think most people know that there are all these steps. We've now spent about 3 weeks sitting down with different government officials trying to parse through all this, and every time you get a slightly different answer. What do you do next? Where do you have to go next? What happens then? But they were quite fascinated by this, and now I asked whether we could do this for a number of other sectors as well. And so we are underway. This is the partner that we're working with there. She gave me this picture. So this is an example of her shelf in her store. And if you notice, half of it is empty. And the reason half of it is empty is because she has to register every product before she can sell it. So what's available on the market in Tanzania is about maybe a half or a third of what you can get on the market in Kenya. We went to meet with one of the big supermarket chains too, and they said, we just can't service the demand to the market because everything has to go through this lengthy regulatory process. So, interesting, right? Interesting way of thinking about the market. And again, my way of thinking about the market before had been much higher level, much more macroeconomic, much more sort of where the trends and how do you think about the industries. This is, I think, really trying to figure out how you can unlock some potential that's there. But clearly it's there. Clearly there. And we've done this now so we've done it in a number of countries for seed, like I showed you, for fertilizer, cosmetics, products like horticulture, shea. So we're doing this kind of analysis in a number of different countries. and using it as a way to try to initiate a dialogue with the government and the private sector so that the systems can change. Now, as we do it, though, we have a whole approach to how we do these things, too. So on this project in Tanzania on cosmetics, we brought in a local law student from University of Dar es Salaam School of Law. And in fact, the dean of the law school was one of the people who's on the government commission to look at this business enabling environment study. So we went and presented at the law school while we were there a week ago. And we had about 4 more diagrams like that too, just on cosmetics. Then we talked through with them. And so he and I talked about whether or not we could use this as a way to try to get more students involved in this type of work. Get them to think about it. And if you look at this diagram here, a lot of the things that are on here are things that we would learn in a trade class. Product standards, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, technical barriers to trade. But this is operational. This is how you take, and if you, as I do in my classes, if you look at what's at the high level in an agreement, this is how it actually winds up, how those agreements wind up getting interpreted and implemented at the country level. Usually an agreement at the WTO doesn't tell you exactly how you implement it. It kind of gives you broad guidelines, but then this is how a country decides to do it. And what happens if that doesn't work? You can't really take it to a case at the WTO. You need a process that's a little bit more granular. And what this partner of ours is trying to do is start something with the other businesses in the country where they can start talking about these things. The seed example is the same thing. The businesses are now meeting regularly to talk through where the problems are in the system. But part of me keeps thinking, how are we going to change these things if we don't have more lawyers who understand them? We did a legal guide a couple of years ago for women entrepreneurs. And one of the things that I found, again, my information gap, right, in my gaps diagram, there was a lot of information that just wasn't there. But one of the things that I kept hearing from the women entrepreneurs were, we can't find lawyers. We can't find lawyers who can help us with these things. There are not a lot of lawyers in the country doing agriculture, despite the fact that there's so much of the potential in the country is in agriculture. So I met with, when I was with the dean last week, I said, is this something we could do something about? Could we start some kind of a program at the law school to enhance the course offerings in agricultural law? Could we do something on trade where students are having exposure to this kind of work so that and if they're a trade negotiator, thinking about things that way, all of those little boxes on that diagram are probably things that they're going to want to negotiate, whether it's at the WTO level or in a trade agreement. They have to know how their system works in order to be able to get what they need out of a negotiation. So here are some of the places where I think things need to move a little bit going forward. One is that I definitely think we need a lot more data. So we have started collecting data, and I've been doing it through these diagrams that I showed you, as a way to kind of map out what's actually happening and then start to collect good practices. But we need a lot more of it if we really want to understand what's happening. Again, we can amass all of the laws, but that's not going to tell us what's really happening in practice. So we've been trying to experiment with different ways. In those diagrams that I showed you now, we're going to digitize those so that we can put them online, you can see the process. And one of the things that we could do if we digitize them is let people comment on them, so that it's no longer than just something in a book somewhere or a report somewhere, that it's actually something that can come to life. And each of the bubbles in the process can be a way of understanding what kinds of problems companies are having. Now, if we go back to the trade negotiator perspective again, thinking about where I was when I was doing trade negotiations on the US side, if we had that kind of information on these systems, if we had that kind of information on where the market opportunity was, we would be able to negotiate better trade agreements. So if we can collect some of this, I think it could possibly change the way that we think about both law and regulation at a very national level, but perhaps also at an international level. And I think one of the other things that's important about it too is that it could be more participatory. So perhaps expecting everyone to go and meet with the regulator is not the way that we should be thinking about law anymore. Maybe there are different ways of interacting with the system rather than just going and meeting with government officials to try to change things. I do think we also need a better sense of what that opportunity is in the market. I still, 20 years after starting, after finishing law school and doing this work, I still don't think we have best ways of seeing where market potential is going, whether it's here in the United States or overseas. I think most governments don't completely know where they're heading economically, and I don't think we have the best models for it. There is one that is out of Harvard and MIT called the Atlas of Economic Complexity. If you've ever looked at it, it looks like DNA mapping for an economy, which is sort of like multi-dimensional comparative advantage and shows a little bit more how you can jump from one thing to another, and is a little bit less of a linear approach too than I often see in economic discussions where, if you're doing one thing at one part of the supply chain that you could move to the next level of value. This is a little bit more about how you build certain types of capabilities and then can jump into certain things. And the example that I remember them using was Nokia, which started out as a lumber company and then went into high-tech manufacturing, which I thought was pretty, not what you would have guessed, right? You would have guessed that if you were doing high-tech manufacturing, you would have been doing maybe something that was slightly lower tech and gone into higher tech. But I think we need some different models for that. And then some models for how we can apply, again, this legal context and all of that. And what are the good regulatory practices? I try now not to say best practices too much because I don't think there is a best practice necessarily. But I think there are good practices. And one of the things that I found when I showed you my Tanzania model on seed, we've done that type of work now in at least 10 countries. So as Rwanda was starting to think about what their seed regulations should look like, we were able to go in and talk through some of the things that we had seen in other countries that were either helpful for making the market grow or a bit problematic, not in a prescriptive way, but just to think through where some of those practices were. And I think also as a lawyer, it's really interesting to be able to look across these systems and see where some of the similarities and differences are. For me, it's completely fascinating. I think it's a different way of thinking about being an international lawyer than I had thought about at the beginning of my career, when I thought I was just learning a body of work, perhaps, or applying it in a negotiation. Now I feel like it's sort of this multi-dimensional chess, and I'm trying to figure out how all of the pieces can work together differently to try to see where some better outcomes could be in the market. So we are trying to think about really creative ways that we can share information and talk through it and work through some of the solutions. I mentioned also SAGCOT. I think some of these models like that are really innovative too, because I think that what they do is help to lower risk in the market. But most of those initiatives don't have lawyers on staff. They maybe have a policy person, if they're lucky, but usually they don't have a lawyer. And so I think that being able to bring the legal discipline has really changed things in some of these partnerships that we have. We talked about how this kind of goes back up to the high level, which I do think is really, really important. But I think in doing that, it's incredibly important to think about how you can make that process more inclusive. When I was in policy making myself, there were a lot of people who wanted that to happen, but they sometimes weren't sure how to do it. And that was why when I left government, I went into the nonprofit side, to the development side of things, to try to really understand how that worked so that I could figure out how you could kind of plug it back into the system. This was what I've come up with as a way to do it within my field. But I think what's interesting to me as I go through this work is that this doesn't have to be just about trade or just about economic regulation. This kind of model, I think, could work in other areas too. And it's been sort of exciting to try to be more entrepreneurial about how to use law. I never would have thought that I would wind up starting my own thing. Never in a million years would have dreamed that that was what I would be doing with my law degree. And I just kept getting to a place where I couldn't figure out how to kind of plug the pieces together, and I finally, after having twins, decided that I had to just start my own thing to make it work. So there are so many different ways, though, of using this, and I've been really fascinated by other models that are out there and ways that we can learn from them. So I think that's where I end. This is this new initiative that we're launching to, as I said, to digitize some of this work and to try to bring the methodology to scale. Because I think that's one of the challenges about all of this too, is how do you really scale it? We have these great projects, but if you can't scale them, then you can't have an impact. I still think you have to start somewhere that's fairly concrete. But I think the scalability is definitely something that we need to think about. So I'm going to leave it with that and hope that you have some questions. And that is my contact information. If you want to get in touch, I'm happy to, always happy to brainstorm or help in any way that I can. But I hope you have questions.
I have questions. What kind of difficulties do you find in countries such as, well, frankly, I'm thinking of my own. I'm Ethiopian, and Ethiopia is far more, say, protected than a country such as Tanzania with its own economy, and sees liberalization as an outcome rather than instigator development, and therefore is a lot more insular. Therefore, it might be a lot more difficult to help out those actors within those countries that are in need of perhaps seed from us. So what kind of difficulties do you find in that type of country, as opposed to Tanzania, which is amongst the more liberalized?
Well, I have to say too, I mean, and this is, I hope off the record I can say this, but when we started doing all this work in Tanzania, there were a lot of people who were very skeptical of Tanzania's commitment too. And I think that's one of the things that we still are, I think one of the other things too is that we really have to share the successes, because I find that the governments too, in this case, I mean, I've seen the government of Tanzania working so hard to change some of these things, and yet, there's still a long list of things that they haven't done. And so I think somehow we have to balance that out a bit. But Ethiopia, I've done some work in Ethiopia too. I think it's a fascinating place and so much potential. I mean, talk about market potential. Ethiopia is just stunning in that regard. But I think the system is different, and it is a bit harder. Again, I feel like if you can turn this on its head a bit, it's a little bit easier to break through some of these log jams than I think if you just go at it saying you have to reform every aspect of your system. I mean, that was what what I saw a lot of my colleagues doing when we were back in my trade negotiator days, which, by the way, was the most amazing job to get training that I could ever have envisioned. But, we had so many things that we were asking countries to change, so many agreements that they had to comply with, so many things that they had to do. And I think sometimes it's almost impossible if you have limited resources to really do all of those things. And it's easy for it to get very politicized. This issue of seed, too, is a very political issue, right? It's incredibly political, whether you let seed in or whether you try to grow it all yourselves. And one of the things that I didn't say when I was using that example of seed is that to actually commercialize seed is not easy. It takes a lot of land. It takes a lot of labor. It's not something that you can do just because you decide to do it. So, but I think that, that in Ethiopia's case too, I think there's a lot that's starting to happen in the market. And if somehow some of those drivers could be used and used through an approach like this, which I think would work in Ethiopia too, even though, as I said, it's a slightly different government structure, I think it could be beneficial. But I think that we spend so much time kind of at that higher level talking about whether the system should look like it does or look like something totally different, that it's hard to not get stuck. There is SADCUT, by the way, this partner that we have in Tanzania, which I think is really truly a pioneer and an innovator itself, has sort of spun off some other institutions in other countries, including the Agricultural Transformation Agency in Ethiopia. So I think, there's potential for some of that kind of thing too. And, and maybe a corridors approach like this at least could be tried out in Ethiopia, where you try to, and I mean, one of the other things about the corridors is you try to cluster in, investment, seed production, fertilizer production, everything that you need to get the sector to grow. So I hope I answered the question, but it's a good question. Other questions? Yes, hi.
Hi, I happened to be reading Haley Sweetland Edwards on shadow courts, on investor-state dispute settlements, which you're probably familiar with. And I wondered whether you had any comments on that kind of clause, which apparently is now widespread in all either binational trade agreements or the larger pacts.
Yeah.
And she takes a fairly critical perspective on those, and that clause, those kinds of clause. And I'm wondering what position you take on that.
So we don't do much work with the arbitration or investor state at all. And I think here's my take on it, just very quickly. I know it's incredibly controversial, and I'm sure it's a topic that gets a lot of discussion here. I know there have been some people here who've done a lot of thinking on this, but here's what I would say. I think protecting investment through law is a good thing generally. Nobody is going to invest if they don't think that there's some sort of predictable outcome. And this is true whether it's my own little company or it's a big multi-million-dollar investment. So I don't think that there's necessarily there's nothing wrong with having some kind of agreement that gives you the legal protection. I think one of the challenges though with something like investor state, that again, it's operating at such a high level that it's not getting into some of these things here at all. I mean, the companies that we're talking about, they wouldn't use those provisions. They're too small. And that's not going to, a small or medium-sized enterprise is not going to use an investor state provision. So what you have in the agreement is sort of impacting, a certain group of companies, but is not going to really impact everybody in the market. I think the other thing too, and I mean, this is one of the things where there's been some really interesting, I think a really interesting evolution in how those provisions have been used, is that increasingly the bilateral investment treaties or the investment provisions and trade agreements have been used to try to bring in some of the social issues and these issues of inclusivity that I talked about, which I think has been sort of this unexpected turn to something that was really, I think had different intentions from the beginning. So that's kind of fascinating to me too. It sort of provided this opening for this new area of law and development that wasn't necessarily there to begin with. But I mean, there's a lot more to be said about the investor state stuff. But those are just two quick thoughts that I think are not always the points that are made in that regard.
Working in the nonprofit sector, how do you see international organizations that also work on trade and development, like UNCTAD or the International Trade Center, compared to maybe the strengths and weaknesses that the nonprofit sector gives you?
So we, as I said before, everything that we do in partnership with other organizations. I mean, there's really no way that any one can do all of this alone. Part of the reason that I like being a smaller nonprofit is that we're really nimble and we can move quickly. We can go into things, and we're also very specialized. So we don't do a lot of things that I think are important to do. We've worked with some of the UN organizations. We've done work with IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development. We work with the World Bank. We've worked with the World Food Program, and I think some of these organizations are doing incredible things. But I do think that they are big institutions, and sometimes the role that they can play in these discussions, and you see this too all over, I think, Sub-Saharan Africa with the World Bank, where there's a lot of respect for the World Bank, but there's also a little bit of a, is that the only model, and is that the only way we should talk about things? That's, it's a complicated relationship, I think, but I feel like there have to be some other voices that are out there as well that can be mutually reinforcing. So I think that, that the work that the big institutions are doing is incredibly important, and they can do things at scale in a way that smaller groups can't, but smaller groups can do things that the bigger ones can't too. So I think you need both.
So you mentioned how law is important to the process of smart lawyers, but do you think it would be better if the lawyers are also trained in, say, international or development economics?
That's a good question. So I studied economics before I studied law, although I felt like I'd sort of erased that part of my mind when I studied law. I definitely think that it helps, but I would say that probably the most important thing for this kind of work is just being flexible and constantly learning, and for me anyway, and not assuming that you have all of the answers to something. When I worked in government, I had 20 different countries that I worked with, and they were, a wide range of different types of economies. And some, the approach that would work with one of them wouldn't work. I worked with Russia, for example, where we had every trade issue under the sun, and then Kyrgyzstan, where they were trying to figure out where their economy was going. And I just think that, really trying to understand as much as it's ever possible to understand what the situation is and figure out how you can use these tools to try to address it. I think it's that flexibility, the creativity, the kind of negotiated approach to being a lawyer that to me was more important than having a particular body of work. But I would say this though, that I wish if I were going back to law school now that I had taken secured transactions and some of these like really practical classes, because at the end of the day, a lot of this stuff is just incredibly nuts and bolts practical. And if you want to change the system, which is part of what we try to do, we're trying to kind of get things to go to a place where they're not already, and you don't know the details, it will not happen. You have to know the details better than everyone else in order to get things to change and move forward positively. So that would be my only thing. I would probably take some more of those. I took every development class, every international class that I could in law school, but I think I would have taken some of the very, very practical things, knowing what I know now about this type of work.
So I don't think there's anybody who can argue that anybody knows more of the details than Katrin. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to snatch her out of here because she's teaching in my class in 3 days. So, but I hope you will take advantage of her being here.